Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prananatha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasya Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Paradavinda Marupananya Bilashujitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelatu Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshitu. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Manda Matir Gati Matsarvasva Param Bhojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamor Madana Mohan Jar Seva Gragunatha Rup Sanatan Adadanastrinam Dantoye Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Param Bhojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhira Pali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Padme Bhaktirya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jatsukyat Vimuktiryaya Shri Radha Ramanam Parambaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Nama Yaram Yanikilaga Shanga Shamani Shrutratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Maha Sagar Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we resume in our discussion in the section on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, specifically the subject matter of jāti buddhi in regard to Vaiṣṇavas. So we've had an in-depth discussion of this, which today, after many segments, we should conclude. And we finished off last time with a very important principle illustrated in some citations given from the Bhakti Sandarbha and Hari Bhakti Vilas, where the concept of respect and the concept of imbibing influence or seeking inspiration are decoupled. In other words, we've illustrated through various statements of various avatars of Bhagavan, as well as statements of Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself, that it is one of the intrinsic duties of a Vaishnava to honor Brāhmaṇas. And yet at the same time, there are statements that prohibit Vaishnavas, or persons who follow the path of bhakti, from associating with non-bhakta Brāhmaṇas. So this is reconciled by Jiva Gosvami by explaining that respect is to be shown unconditionally. In other words, respect is not based on a person's ideology. Respect is due to a person based on the perception of the presence of one's Ishta Devata within the core of that person, and because of that person's intrinsic spiritual nature, not because of the particular opinions or beliefs or attitudes that they foster within their mind. So respect is to be shown to everyone by virtue of the presence of Bhagavan within them. And moreover, Brahmins are to be shown respect because of their birth, because of the samskars they undergo, because of their role in sustaining social cohesion and the contribution they make to society. And again, this entire discussion is within the kind of classical scriptural model of the Varnashram society. We're speaking to those norms, if you will. So in that context, the Brahman is specially worthy of honor for those two principal reasons. And whether that Brahman is a bhakta or not doesn't have any bearing on their respectability. So respect is to be shown to them unconditionally. Yet, even while respecting them, if they're a non-bhakta, and if they're, as he pointed out, persons who know about bhakti and still elect not to follow the path, then we won't respect them in a way that we imbibe their attitudes, or that we will take guidance from them as far as how we will navigate our path. We will follow the path of bhakti, but we will nevertheless even respect those persons who don't, because of the presence of the Ishta Devata, because of the inherent respectability of the Brahmana, etc. So this matter was where we left off last time, and today we'll come to some final points about this idea of jāti buddhi. So what that point that we left off with last time also shows is that the prohibition on, quote, jāti buddhi, or thinking of a caste in regard to a Vaishnava, doesn't actually imply that one becomes caste blind, or what you might call color blind, so to speak. In other words, it's not that one doesn't recognize that a Vaishnava is born in a particular caste, or not. In other words, caste is still considered, but in the case of Vaishnavas, respect should be shown whether or not the person has what is conventionally considered a respectable caste or not. The Vaishnavatva of everyone is to be respected unconditionally, and as we talked about last time, the Vaishnava is actually more respectable than a Brahmana, and greater respect is to be shown to them. So a Vaishnava shouldn't be denied that special greater respect just because they're not born in a high caste, but at the same time, those who are born in a high caste, even if they're not bhaktas, are still to be respected for the sake of their caste. So this was the balance point we got to so far. So today we'll conclude this whole subject matter. So I pick up from where we left off. This is just following a citation from Bhakti Sandarbha 247 that we discussed last time. So, Sri Jivapad's advice here directly illustrates the significance of the statement in the verse under discussion, that one should not foster jāti buddhi, that is, the notion of a caste in regard to a Vaishnava. One should not judge the caste or conduct of a Vaishnava, and instead should respect a Vaishnava even if the Vaishnava was born in a low caste or is still somehow engaged in misconduct. So this is another point that came up last time, referring to the Gita 9:30, that abhichet suduracharo, even if someone has severe misconduct, that the presence of their conviction in the path of bhakti, the presence of their conviction in worship of the supreme Ishvara, this makes them worthy of respect, even if their behavior isn't fully in conformity with the ideal that they foster. So then, in other words, convictions and conduct are causes of respect, or in other words, they should be respected when they're present, but even in their absence, there's still a respectability that is retained. So there's inherent respectability irrespective of conduct, irrespective of conviction, but when there's that inherent respectability, and on top of that conviction, that's to be respected. And then when there's the inherent respectability plus the conviction plus conduct, then even more respectable. So these are bearers on the degree of respectability, but they don't cancel out the inherent respectability. This is the critical balance. Srimad Mahaprabhu also personally gives the following advice in this regard. So this comes from the Chaitanya Bhagavat. Caste, and in this case, by speaking of caste, it means high caste or birth in a high caste. Family, meaning birth in a noble family. Accomplishment, meaning doing great things. And wealth, do not do anything. That is, cannot enable one to attain Krishna. So from a bhakti-centric perspective, just because you have a high caste, just because you have a high family, just because you achieve various successes in the world, just because you have wealth, that doesn't get you anywhere on the path of bhakti alone. In other words, to get far on the path of bhakti, what do you need? Bhakti. If you don't have that, you might have all these other things, but you're still not where you need to be. So without the wealth of prema and heartache, arti, or this, longing or feeling of absence in the heart, one does not attain Krishna. So what is valuable on the path of bhakti? It is prem and prema's couple, humility, or arti, as we discussed at length in regard to the Chernadopisi verse. So this statement here in the Chaitanya Bhagavat nicely complements that analysis of Sanatana Gosvami. A Vaishnava's birth may be in any family. Why not? Meaning, it doesn't matter. Still, all the Shastras say the Vaishnava is the most exalted of all. That is, a Vaishnava is most exalted in comparison to anyone of any caste. It doesn't matter what caste the Vaishnava was born in. So, exalted above all and beyond all who neglect to engage in bhakti to Bhagavan, regardless of their caste, family, accomplishments, and wealth. The evidence this of Yavana Haridas, who saw a manifestation of Bhagavan difficult to attain even for Brahma and others. So Haridas Thakur was more respectable even though he was considered of low caste, of no wealth, of no great worldly accomplishment, of anything like that. So he was more honorable than anyone who had all these other things. A sinner who fosters jāti buddhi. So now we have a statement of Mahaprabhu himself in the Chaitanya Bhagavat speaking directly to our subject matter. So why would the verse that we're talking about all this time prohibit jāti buddhi, or the consideration of caste? Here's Mahaprabhu himself explaining why. So one, or a sinful person, meaning anyone who fosters jāti buddhi, that is, considers a Vaishnava to belong to a caste and be no different than others in that caste, sinks to a lowly life form and dies birth after birth. So, strong condemnation from Mahaprabhu himself. In other words, if one gives precedent to the significance of caste beyond the significance of conviction, or beyond the significance of the actual attunement of the person's psyche, if one prioritizes, in one sense, the external over the internal, that leads to oneself becoming, divergent from or deprived of experience and understanding of the value of the internal, or of the value of that, of conviction and adherence to the path of bhakti over and above anything else. So, a practically significant point in this teaching of Srimad Mahaprabhu is that even while he condemns jāti buddhi in regard to a Vaishnava, he nevertheless still speaks of Haridas Thakur's caste. So this is a nice observation, right? That's why I left here in the translation. He says, Yavana Haridas. And this is just, straight in the Bengali itself. Etar Praman, Yavana Haridas. So it's not that because we don't think of a caste in regard to Vaishnavas, we can't ever say that someone is like this or that someone was born in such and such caste. No, we can say it, we can observe it, we know what is the speak caste of someone, but we don't diminish our respect for them because of it. So it's not that we pretend it's not there, that it's prohibited to mention. We can acknowledge it, but in acknowledging it, how we actually honor the person is what matters. So this is what we can draw from the words of Mahaprabhu. Elsewhere in Chaitanya Bhagavat and Chaitanya Charitamrita, numerous descriptions of various companions of Sriman Mahaprabhu are given that mention the caste to which these Vaishnavas belonged, be it regarded as high or low. For example, the high-class Brahmana Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, upon observing the arrival of a personal servant of Sriman Mahaprabhu's guru, Ishvara Puri, who was born a Shudra and named Govinda, once asked Mahaprabhu, why did Puri Goshai keep a Shudra servant? So typically Brahmins won't accept service from non-Brahmanas. So why would he accept a service from a Shudra? Sriman Mahaprabhu replied with a pun on the word Ishvara. So Mahaprabhu says, Ishvara is completely independent. So, Ishvara meaning Bhagavan, as well as Ishvara meaning Ishvara Puri. Ishvara's grace is not dependent on the Vedas. That is, the rules of Dharma given in the Vedas. So, Ishvara Puri can give his grace to a Shudra if he wants. He doesn't need to follow the conduct that a formal Brahmin does in, keeping these caste demarcations in society. Vaishnava renunciates like Ishvara Puri are not bound by such rules. And similarly, Bhagavan's grace is not bound by these rules. It's not that taking birth in a particular family bars you or privileges you to the grace of Bhagavan. Ishvara's grace does not consider caste or family. So grace will go where it wishes to go. Caste doesn't merit you that necessarily or prohibit that for you necessarily. Krishna ate in the home of Vidura, that is a Shudra, which is something we'll talk about soon in the coming verses. Ishvara's grace depends only on a trace of affection. So where does Ishvara's grace go then? If it doesn't come to you because of your caste or your family or the rules of the Veda or this or that, it comes in response to affection, or in other words, where there is some love, where there is some bhakti in the heart of someone, Bhagavan gives his grace, sadhus, Ishvara Puri give their grace. What is their caste, what else doesn't matter. Controlled by affection, it acts independently. There is 1 crore more happiness in affectionate behavior than in formality. Aha, just here. Marjada hoite koti sukh sneha acharane. This is a grand statement, right? That loving behavior, loving exchange is 1 crore of times better than formal etiquette. This is spoken by none other than Mahaprabhu. So, where, even today, whether it's, caste conventions or even among Vaishnavas where there's formal conventions of sadachar and where there's preoccupation with such formal conventions of conduct and etiquette, when those things overshadow and those things inhibit or diminish the richness of an affectionate exchange, of a loving exchange, then that's a loss. Then there's a loss of joy there, as proper as it may be, or as, satisfying it may be to people. In other words, there will be a sense of satisfaction in performing things excellently or expertly or accurately or properly. that satisfaction is far less than the satisfaction that comes from a loving exchange. But my personal comment or 2 cents on this point is that one has to have received and experienced some of that loving affection in order to feel the difference. In other words, if Vaishnavas live where there's like a constant and a continuous preoccupation with formality and etiquette, and they've never experienced the difference where there's an exchange of love and affection doesn't have a bearing on those things, they don't know the difference. They don't know what they're missing, and therefore there can be a very strong tendency to keep up the formality of the etiquette. And also, there's undoubtedly an imperative to do so. Elsewhere in the Charitamrita itself, this point is made. Marjita rakshana or marjana palanahoi sadhura bhushan. Mahaprabhu himself also teaches that to sustain the etiquette or to keep up the etiquette is one of the jewels or one of the ornaments on a Vaishnava. In other words, it's an endearing quality of a Vaishnava to follow the etiquette. So it's not that this statement here is saying that we should do away with the etiquette. The etiquette is also there. It should also be maintained, but it should be maintained in a way that it doesn't overshadow and it doesn't restrict the richness of affection. And it doesn't need to be the focus. In other words, people should be educated in it, and then the maturity of that education comes where the formalities start to function automatically and naturally, and on the stage of that, if you will, then the richness of affectionate exchange can flourish. And that's what we see in the beauty of Gora Lila and all these greetings and meetings and all the richness of exchange in the context of a community that adhered to these Sadachara principles. So Mahaprabhu here is giving stress to the beauty of the affectionate side, that affection is what draws the grace of Bhagavan, and affection is far more satisfying to everyone than simply upkeep of the etiquette. So by hearing of it, the highest bliss occurs. In other words, what to speak of even doing it? Just being reminded of this is a cause of joy. Saying this, Prabhu embraced Govinda. Aha. So Sarvabhauma, why this? And Mahaprabhu saying, oh, you don't know. This is 1,000,000 times better than just following your formal Brahmin etiquette. Come here, my friend. And he's giving a nice hug to Govinda. So this is a very nice passage here in the Charitamrita, with humor and a pun and some charming behavior as well. So this is also to show that Mahaprabhu, what to speak of just showing respect, you could say respect is the foundation for love. If you don't really, if two people don't really respect each other, they're not going to succeed in loving each other. They're not even going to succeed in trusting each other. So to actually love each other, they have to be able to trust each other. And to trust each other, they have to both have the capacity to respect one another and succeed in the other recognizing the presence of that respect, because people trust when they feel respected. So respect, trust, plus trust equals potential for love. So here, when these points are brought out, then you can, the ingredients are being, presented whereby these things can all flow. So, this citation I'm bringing here just to reiterate that there is recognition of Govinda's caste. In other words, the fact that he's a Shudra, it's not like, oh, don't say he's a Shudra. It's like, we all know he's a Shudra, but we don't care. So it's not that this prohibition on jāti buddhi means like you can't be aware of those things or you don't know those things. You know them. So the buddhi sense is not just cognition full stop, but rather the sense of preeminence in one's mentality towards the person. That's what's being censured. So further evidence in this regard, Sri Sanatana Pad, in his Digdarshani Tika on Hari Bhakti Vilas, also speaks of Sri Raghunath Das Goswami Pad as, quote, the son of the Kayasta community of Gauda. So Kayasta was a middle to, medieval going into, modern caste within the Bengali society, which was sub-Brahmin, but considered still of what they call the Vaidyas, the Kayastas, and the Brahmanas were collectively the three generally higher respected castes in the late medieval period. So, Sanatana Gosvami in the Hari Bhakti Vilas speaks of Raghunath Das, who was born in a Kayasta family, as, quote, the son of the Kayasta community of Gauda. So he's talking about Raghunath's caste. He's not just, Raghunath's a Vaiṣṇava, don't talk about his caste. He's saying Raghunath was a Kayasta, but he's the son of that Kayasta. In other words, he's like the shining great one among them. Moreover, even Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Bhagavad-gita speaks of the caste status of those who take shelter in him, and indicates that higher caste status is advantageous in this regard. So in the Gita, we also find the following evidence. Mam hi partavya-pashrita yepi su papayonayaha striyo vaishas tata shudras tepi yanti param gatim kim punar brahmana punya bhakta rajar shayas tata. O Partha, by taking shelter in me, somehow or other, that is, in a deformed manner because of disregard for injunctions and so on. So that's the interpretation given by Sanatana Gosvami. So when it says, by taking shelter in me, somehow, means not quite in the ideal way. This is, so the word is not just ashrita, but vyapashrita, vi-apa-shrita. So he draws out of those prefixes this interpretation, that it means not in the ideal manner, but somehow or other. So in other words, even if they take shelter in me, even incorrectly, or not even in the ideal way, still, even those of sinful birth, that is, those of low birth, outcasts, etc., women, Vaishyas, and Shudras certainly attain the supreme destination. So in other words, anyone, regardless of their birth, if they take shelter in me, even in the improper way, can all still attain the greatest. So then you might say, well, then the whole point is Krishna saying that caste is just irrelevant and it doesn't even matter? Not quite. He's saying that taking shelter in me is really the most significant, important thing. But, he goes on to say, what more is to be said of meritorious Brahmins and royal seers who are bhaktas of mine? But nevertheless, if you take shelter in me, if you're my bhakta, and on top of that, you have a noble birth, and in other words, on top of that, you're in a cultured, privileged position, then you're all the more disposed to succeeding in the path of bhakti. So he does say that, or he does imply here, that birth in a higher caste is something favorable. It is something valuable in terms of the potential that one has to follow the path of bhakti. So it's not that it's utterly irrelevant to the path of bhakti. Sri Sanatana Pad illuminates the purport of these verses as follows. So Sanatana Gosvami cites this verse in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, and there he comments as follows. Bhakti to me purifies those devoid of right conduct. What is surprising about that when bhakti to me, or even taking shelter in, me, somehow or other, liberates from samsara even those devoid of eligibility who are even of low families. So bhakti is purifying, definitely. And beyond that, even sharanagati, in other words, even, he's speaking of sharanagati as distinct from bhakti, and we know that sharanagati is also a limb of bhakti, but as we've discussed in other contexts, it's, in Sanatana Goswami's view, something that's more accessible than the other angas of bhakti as a whole. So this more accessible, just attitude of belonging to Bhagavan. If someone can't even do bhakti but can just somehow or another get this into their mind that they belong to him, Bhagavadi-oham, as he discusses later in the text, which we've discussed repeatedly in the other classes, then that itself can liberate from samsara even people who are low-born, even people who are otherwise not even eligible. So that is what is taught in this verse. And he goes on, when such is certain, that is, when even those of sinful birth, women, Vaishyas, and Shudras certainly attain the supreme destination by taking shelter in me somehow or other, then what need is there to say that bhaktas of mine who are of noble caste, noble family, and right conduct attain the supreme destination? Thus he says, Kim, he speaks the second verse. So taking shelter in me is so valuable, it'll override the fact that you're devoid of good conduct. But if you take shelter in me and you already have good conduct, then, it's like a slam dunk, so to speak. It's just an automatic, success. This is how he's interpreting the point. So what that implies is that that type of noble birth and culturing and conduct is also of value, or is indirectly conducive to succeeding in the path of bhakti. Not causatively, but correlatively, or you could say circumstantially. From these descriptions, it is to be understood that although a Vaishnava is not to be considered equal to the members of the caste into which they were born, and irrespective of their caste is worthy of the highest respect greater than that due to any of the castes, still, general respect is also shown to members of the higher castes, regardless of whether they are Vaishnavas or not, and the caste status of Vaishnavas is also observed and spoken of without being considered jāti buddhi, meaning without that being considered a failure to understand and respect the preeminence of Vaishnavas within the Varnashram society, and thus an instance of offense. In gist, when a Vaishnava is spoken of with reference to their caste, this is done with an understanding and a respect for the Vaishnava's transcendence of caste, such that a Vaishnava is seen to be both possessed of caste and beyond it. Examples of Vaishnavas of the Brahman caste showing great respect even to Vaishnavas of the lowest caste can be found in the Leelas of Sriman Mahaprabhu's companions. For example, at a Shraddha ceremony, wherein the custom is to invite, honor, and feed numerous Brāhmaṇas, Sri Advaitacharya Prabhu, himself a Brahmana of noble family, in the presence of many Brāhmaṇas, first offered Sri Haridas Thakur an honorary plate of food. And he remarked in this regard, if you eat, there occurs the feeding of 1 crore of Brāhmanas. Saying this, he fed the Shraddha Patra to Haridas Thakur. So we see this evidence in the Chaitanya Lila, that Advaitacharya shows respect to Haridas Thakur, a Yavana, in front of so many Brāhmanas. And those Brāhmanas didn't like that, and they got very upset with Advaitacharya. But this was Advaitacharya's conviction in these teachings of the Bhagavatam and the other texts that we're describing, which we quoted in the last class, that a Vaishnava is even more respectable than a Chaturvedi Brahmana. And he is to be given charity, his prasad is to be accepted, he is worshipable like Bhagavan himself. Those verses we read last time, this instance of Advaitacharya's behavior is a good example of that. Alternately, Sriman Mahaprabhu and other Brahmana Vaishnavas are never observed to have eaten food cooked by non-Brahman Vaishnavas. Now here's another point on the other side. In other words, you might say, okay, Advaitacharya, Mahaprabhu, they're teaching all these things, the grace of Bhagavan goes wherever there's love, caste doesn't matter, and we shouldn't judge the caste of people, and if you do, you go to hell, and all of this. But practically speaking, Mahaprabhu still never ate food cooked by someone who wasn't a Brahmin. They had to be a Vaishnav, and they had to be a Brahmin. There's even the case when he's traveling, he comes to Mathura, and then there was a person of this, quote, Sanuriya Brahmana, who was a class of Brahmanas, but was considered low within the Brahman category, or not what they call the Kulin Brahmanas, or not the upper standard Brahmanas. So that would, in the view of some, constitute eating outside of one's caste and be a fault. But Mahaprabhu elected to do it anyway, knowing that people wouldn't like it, because his Param Guru Madhavendra Puri had accepted that Vaishnava's cooking. And Mahaprabhu, that's when he quotes the famous statement, Maha Jana Yena Gota Sapunta, that by which the Mahajans have gone is the path. So, because Ishvara Puri set this precedent, I follow that, even if people don't like it, or even if some people don't understand or don't recognize the value of that. So, that same statement that we quoted last time, his cooking or his prasad is to be accepted. Mahaprabhu, in one sense, accepted that. So, that was, you could say, socially progressive, if you will, but only to a limited extent. In other words, Mahaprabhu did that with a Sonariya Brahmana, but not with a non-Brahmana, not with a Shudra. You don't hear cases of Govinda cooking for Mahaprabhu. Govinda can serve Mahaprabhu, Govinda can massage Mahaprabhu, Govinda can even step over Mahaprabhu for the sake of doing his service, as that wonderful instance is recorded in the Antilila, but he can't cook. Advaitacharya can cook, Jagadananda Pandit can cook, Gadadhar Pandit can cook, all these Brahmanas with Mahaprabhu can cook, but Govinda cannot cook. So there were still some of these rules in place within the Gaura Lila. So there was still some, you could say, caste judgment and demarcation even among these Parshadas, even among these Vaishnavas. So does that mean they didn't respect Govinda? No. As per the verses we quoted earlier, there's, 10 million times more satisfaction in accepting this Vaishnava and having loving dealings with this Vaishnava than there is in excluding a Vaishnava who, in this case is one of Mahaprabhu's own Guru brothers and was a servant of Ishvara Puri, to exclude him just because he was not born among the Brahmanas. That would be contrary to the spirit of Vaishnavism. So Mahaprabhu accepted him because his Guru had also accepted him, but didn't accept him, dare I say in one sense, fully. In other words, he didn't accept him as someone who could cook for him, but he accepted him as a companion. So there was, in this sense, a certain layer where these caste distinctions still wove their way into the social fabric of Mahaprabhu's community. So it's not that they're sort of made completely insignificant or completely removed from the way that these things would happen, but there was a recognition of them, an acceptance of them, and then you could say an enablement of everyone to contribute or perform a role within the gradation that they laid out, so to speak. So Govinda could bring the plate, he could, offer the massage, he could do this, he could do that, he could do so many things, but there were also things that he wasn't allowed to do, and vice versa. So, quote, this shows that they did indeed retain a certain degree of demarcation in formal social etiquette and exchanges between Vaishnavas of different castes. And you also see discussion of this in the Ramanuja Sampradaya. Ramanuja accepted Diksha from a Vaishnava who was a Shudra Mahapurna, although he was a Brahmana. And in other Vaishnava communities, the necessity of showing and integrating the presence of non-Brahmana Vaishnavas and honoring them has also been something of historical significance for which there is precedent. So, let me conclude. In summary, the censure in the verse under discussion of, quote, the notion of a caste in relation to a Vaishnava, Vaisṇave jāti buddhiḥ, is stated to convey the essence of the Shastra's advice, that respect is to be shown to everyone and everything in accord with the degree of respect so due. And thus, the purpose of the censure of jāti buddhi in regard to Vaiṣṇavas is not to completely eliminate any awareness of the caste into which a Vaiṣṇava was born, but rather to ensure that Vaiṣṇavas are understood to have transcended their caste and thus become worthy of special respect that exceeds not only that of their own caste, whatever it may be, but even that of the most respectable of all castes, the Brāhmana caste. Thus, Vaishnava etiquette, as taught by the aforecited commentators on Srimad Bhagavatam, enjoins honoring Brahmanas proportionately for their birth, qualities, knowledge, and conduct in a befitting manner because this is pleasing to Sri Bhagavan. Honoring specially respectable qualities in whomsoever they observed, and honoring Vaishnavas above all, even more so than Brahmanas, by virtue of their bhakti to Bhagavan, Bhagavan's consequent special presence within them, and the special satisfaction Bhagavan feels when his bhaktas are fittingly honored, as was also discussed in regard to the qualities of respectfulness mentioned in Srimad Mahaprabhu's celebrated teaching, Trinadupi Sunichina, cited earlier in Padyavali. So ultimately, all these things have practical application because following Mahaprabhu's advice to be humble like a blade of grass, or humbler than a blade of grass, and to give respect to everyone, as appropriate, knowing all of these principles enables us to do that, enables us to show respect to everyone, and not too much respect to where it's not that much respect is meant, and also not too little respect where more ample respect is meant, but to have a sense of both how to assess the relative respectability of others, and then to how to express or to honor that accordingly. So all of these things are practical and ultimately guide the Vaishnava in avoiding committing aparad, as well as fostering the respectful attitude that is conducive to the flourishing of what you might arguably call deeper Vaishnava sentiments, or from that attitude of respect will come, the flow, or, an abundance of bhakti and, even richer forms of exchange, affection, and so forth. So that's what we have on this topic. As I said, it was going to be a long and technical discussion, but now after a number of segments, we've come at least as far as I've elected to go with it, which perhaps was a bit long-winded, but I hope has also brought out a number of nice balance points or subtleties, and can, give us the ability to do a bit of what you might call integrative thinking, or how to understand multiple teachings and where they appear to come into tension, or where there can be complexity in how to apply them, and then understanding what will be an ideal type of practical application. So I might just conclude here a little bit early today, just to cap off the whole discussion on this theme. And then in the coming class, we'll dive into the remaining segments of our commentary on this verse about the various aspects of Bhagavad-dharma. So none of the other sections will be this elaborate, but we'll look also at honoring the water that has washed the feet of Vaishnavas, as well as that of Bhagavan. We'll also look at why Bhagavan is especially honorable among all devatas, and some of the remaining points in this verse in the coming classes. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or anything otherwise, please feel free.
Might have some few words to say, because
Sure.
can you hear me? Yeah. Everything's nice and clear, but how do you apply? I mean, most of us, like that in the group here, they're all Westerners. How do you apply this in the sense of like broader? I mean, obviously you have to be in a broader association, like of other Vaishnavas of different jāti in order to be able to apply it really. Otherwise, like there was no concept of Videshi Brahmana, Vaishnava in Chaitanya. I mean, like Yavana, of course, but those exceptions. But in light of the modern time, how this plays. I mean, besides the appreciating the fact that Vaishnavas are higher than Vaishnavata supersedes the jāti, but still, how does it function practically in Western society of Vaishnavas? I can brief on that because I'm just trying to think.
Among Westerners, I would say it doesn't have that much practical application when people are all without a jāti, so to speak, or who aren't Brāhmaṇas, or among whom these elements are not there, then it's less of a factor. I mean, it's not a factor in one sense, but it's part of the overall fabric of understanding the respectability of others. And as we talked about in the Trinadu Pisunichina discussion, the gradation of respectability is fundamentally based on the intensity of the awareness of Bhagavan in the other. So Vaishnavas are respected specially among human beings because they foster a deeper degree of awareness related to Bhagavan and conduct expressive of that. And then proportionately, those among Vaishnavas who show a greater intensity of that are shown a bit extra respect along the lines of that verse in the Upadeshamrita that we referred to. So, how to deal with all the role of caste and all that is, in one sense, it's nice and simple when those elements are not present among persons who aren't born in that social fabric. But simply put, I would just say that much.
So I guess we can simply appreciate the discussion from the, ontological or siddhantic point of view. But
yeah, nice. And many of us go to India frequently. We're part of, the broader Indian context as well. And if we do visit India occasionally, then we definitely want to know some of these things and, have a respectful attitude when we visit there. And I would add also that if we are, in one sense, if this doesn't sound pretentious, like ambassadors of Vaishnava culture to the broader world, as persons who are both born and raised in another social context, but have some level of faith and education in this culture, then we're kind of in this middle point, culturally speaking, and we can also introduce people to some of these, what you might call foreign features, because historically among popular society as well as the academy, there's a lot of times been a very critical attitude towards the quote caste system and, a sense of it being, something corrupt or something that is, fundamentally racist or disenfranchising. So we also can, by understanding the way the scriptures have discussed these things, we also can introduce people to it in a way where they can at least file it in a unique category, because there's a common tendency to say, oh, these people say that, some people should be offered special respect just based on their birth and other people shouldn't get that respect. That's racist, And then all the narrative that goes on about the critique of racism based on, colonialism and, the history of slave trades and all this, then there's a common tendency to take that whole narrative and then assume that this is just the same thing. And to be generous, we can say there are maybe some similarities, but there's a lot more to it in this case than, to compare, a colonialist, racist society with the Varnashram system of Puranic literature. This is, you could say, an unfortunate, a lack of, not understand the great difference between those two things will lead to a lot of unnecessary argument and a negative perception towards something that actually has a lot more intricacy to it. So we can also have a role as I said, as people kind of in the middle who can try to speak about it or to represent it in not that we directly represent it, but we can at least represent discourse about it in a way that can invite attention to its specific characteristics rather than it just being assumed to be certain things that are held in low esteem by dominant narratives in other social contexts of today.
Yeah, I remember we were in Puri long ago, like in the 90s, and we were just talking to a local panda, and he said, yes, you, next life, because we were just claiming we're devotees, we're Vaiṣṇavas, and says, no, next life, if you stay here and you acquaint yourself with our culture and you integrate, you eat food and custom, and the next life we born here, then you can be qualified as a Vaiṣṇava, proper Vaiṣṇava. And to some extent, I sympathize with that, and I felt, yeah, that's something that, I mean, not to minimize that person of Vaishnava, but truly speaking, Vaishnava culture has a basis. I mean, the Vaishnava culture has perfect environment in India. I would say, it's in places like holy places where there's culture or tradition, history. So in one sense, I appreciate this remark, but on other sense, well, Krishna appreciates anybody who chants Harinam, right? And that.
Yeah, I mean, it's two-sided. I mean, we can't deny that the value of the samskar and the birth in Bharat is a value. It's definitely a value to appreciating this culture, which is from that land and is deeply part of that cultural imaginary, if you will. But at the same time, that very culture also teaches that the certain power of the transcendental elements within it has the ability to override certain defects, including the defect of the lack of cultural samskar produced by a favorable birth within it. And so we can honor the value of that birth and of that cultural upbringing, but at the same time we can say that it's not 100% essential. I can give an example. I'll from my personal experience, which I found interesting, and I don't say this about myself personally. I happen to be part of the exchange, but I'm just representing a category. But I remember once was with some Vaiṣṇavas, and we came as a group to meet Vinod Biharidas Babaji Maharaj of Barshana. And there was a conversation with him about some things, and I made some remarks in the course of the conversation, and then another Babaji who was kind of leading the group that we were in, he made a remark to Vinod Baba about me, saying, he said something praiseworthy or respectful of me, and said that, because of this, in his next life, he'll be born here in Braj, and he'll get the chance to, become like, follow fully and get everything. And then Vinod Baba said, no, that he can't attain everything in this life. You shouldn't say like that. It's also possible for him to attain everything even without that birth. And sort of corrected that remark of that other Babaji. And then that Babaji was a little bit, I think he was slightly taken aback to get corrected in front of everyone. And then at the end, Vinod Baba came and bear hugged him really tight and kind of sort of, don't be upset that I corrected you, or don't feel bad, and gave him a very affectionate embrace as we left. So, I'm not saying that has any bearing on me as an individual. It was really I'm just a white face. In other words, it doesn't have anything to do with me, but the fact that they were talking like that was more about the philosophical principle of, is it possible to achieve success on the path of bhakti without a birth in India? And in principle, it is possible, but is it but does that deny that it's not beneficial to be born in that context? Doesn't deny that either. In other words, yes, it's favorable, and yes, maybe some people who are not born in India and who follow the path of bhakti will be born in India in their next life. Like, that's also possible, and their trajectory might go in that way, and that's also good, but it's not that it has to be that way either. So anyway, just to complement what you were saying, that's just a real life, so to speak, exchange where that topic was discussed.
Can we possibly say that, based on this, that just like Vaiṣṇava is compared to a Brāhmana who can perform samayaga, his capacity to perform, the same way Videshi Bhakta has a capacity to attain Braj Lila in this life. There's a capacity, but that the kind of comparison, would that be too much to stretch?
No, I mean, if someone follows this path and succeeds in this path, then they'll attain the goal, and it's not impossible that even someone born outside the culture could succeed in following the path. May not be common, but it's not impossible either.
Because just like you give example of Bihari Baba, and this, making a philosophical remark and then having this beautiful, respectful Vaishnava exchange with this Vaishnava afterwards to calm him down, to pacify. This is the culture that is very specific to Indian Vaishnavas, I would say. India has this very gentle, respectful way of dealing, culturally speaking. That this translates into Vaishnava society. It multiplies the devotion, I would say. That exchange itself. Kind, respectful, trying to avoid offenses by any means.
Yes, indeed. The respect and affection are the grease, if you will, that enables someone to proceed smoothly and nicely on the path. All right, well, maybe we can leave it at that for today. And if we're so blessed, then in our next session, we'll proceed further into our discussion of Bhagavad-dharma-tattva. So I conclude here.
Maharaj,
Yes.
I had a question, but I don't think you
sir,
can hear me.
Please go for it if
Okay.
it's on this theme.
Okay, no, this is short. I think the fact I'm reflecting on the story you told about Mahaprabhu. Govinda was of a lower caste, and he could massage the body of the Lord, but he couldn't cook for him. For me, that's just mind-boggling. You know what I mean? It's like, oh my gosh. So, but I'm thinking it opens the door for a variety of opinions about this subject. In other words, if Mahaprabhu even had this restriction, what to speak of people today? So, it makes me think, well, there are some people that think this is a black and white situation, that you're a Vaishnava, you can do the yajna, you can be a guru, doesn't matter what your caste is. And then there's other people that no, it's not like that. But it makes me think that we have to be willing to accept some variety on this position, because it's not really clear cut. What do you think?
I think that seems safe to me, given how much cultural blending has come to pass over the last 500 years, and the India of today is not the India of the 1600s or the Puranic India of antiquity. So, to try to sort of enforce certain norms from that past social context onto today's society doesn't always work, so to speak. So, in other words, there's some people born in India today, but they live a life that's largely or almost entirely westernized, especially in modern areas. So in that context, to limit maybe a more liberal attitude might not be appropriate. But at the same time, for those who are born and raised in a very traditional context, like, for example, some of the, families of descendants of Mahaprabhu who are born into a 15 generation tradition of sustaining Gaudiya Vaishnava practice, and if they feel it's important for them to sustain some of their family traditions and they don't want to eat at the house of any and all Vaishnavas, for me, I completely understand that. I wouldn't, be upset that they're like, don't want to eat cooking from me or something like this, that they want to continue some of those caste distinctions, if you will, or, for me, that's also perfectly appropriate. And so I feel like there are individual cases and the particular preferences or leanings of different groups and different contexts are fine to be respected. And it's hard to make a blanket analysis or case for everything being only one way.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
All right. Vaiṣṇavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Hey, Shyam. Thank you.
Jai Radhe.